and the painting.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we are live. Hopefully, we can go ahead and get started. So I'll read off the first question. So we are going to be talking as a group about the Hanjin situation. First question is, what have been the global ramifications of Hanjin's bankruptcy, and how long will we feel the effects of that? Who would like to go first?
So just talking maybe the world that I know, thinking about it from a Nike perspective. So through the 18 months following this event, we basically ended up in a position where we were in full-on inventory cleanup mode. So on one hand, we had a lot of inventory that we were expecting in the marketplace where we saw coverage fall short because we had all this product sitting on Hanjin ships out in the ocean and kind of sitting in limbo as we watched coverage drop off. And at the same time, we had to expedite manufacturing and really take a loss on margin to be able to divert additional product via airship. So we took a big hit on margin. We saw a big spike in total owned inventory. We had a lot of frustration from our retailers. And even after the issues were resolved, what we ended up with is a really dirty marketplace where basically we had the options of basically flushing product to value. So it ends up in TJ Maxx or in a worst case scenario, a Costco, or we end up holding inventory back or even in some cases destroying it. So particularly in the North America market, I would say that this was something that had multiple years of fallout. And I think really from an inventory perspective in terms of not being able to meet marketplace demand, and then following that from a brand perspective where you end up having Nike products showing up in stores where we never want to have it. I think we're continuing to just see the tail end of that now.
Yeah, I think what I read that I found really interesting and surprising was how many people were stuck on all the ships. So I read 89 vessels stranded at sea, like 25,000 sailors also stranded, $14 billion worth of cargo. So that number was just astonishing. And I can't imagine what it's like to be on those ships during that. And I also found it interesting too that, ports were basically denying, right, these ships to port because they were scared that their companies wouldn't get paid and that Honda didn't have funds to be able to take care of all their merchandise and the people on board.
Well, for me, as I was reading the articles, I found myself looking at the timeline and when the articles were published, and I noticed it was like around September or so. So it's a couple months before the holiday season. So I think a lot of like for example Nike or a lot of retailers had some shipments stuck in the port. So that's kind of how I was thinking about it too.
Yeah, definitely like what you mentioned earlier, Ivan, when we were talking about how the situation definitely affected like electronics suppliers and toy retailers quite a bit, especially like you said, coming up before the holiday season, which is, their busy season.
Yeah, and I think that was probably one of the more substantial global ramifications of Hanjin's bankruptcy. Like when they did finally pull out of the market and the crisis, I would say, that hit with cargo being stranded at sea for companies like Nike or, like Ivan was saying, for retailers right before the peak season. It was just that. It was just the ambiguity of not knowing what's going to happen with the cargo. I mean, they had boats on the water halfway to the U.S. or halfway to another country, to Europe or wherever, when they decided to kind of pull the plug. And they knew that it was coming, but they still allowed the shipments to leave without consigning to other carriers or to like handing over to other shippers in that sense. And I don't think that it was negligent, really. I mean, I think that they were like hoping that they would, at the 11th hour, something would happen to change their situation. And I mean, that even shows by the CEO's personal investment in paying some of the fees to make sure that those ships got unloaded, or to make sure that crew could get off the boat eventually, because they would let them dock at a port. So I think that it was really just like they were trying to save the company all the way up until the end. And as far as like global ramifications of the Hanjin's bankruptcy. I mean, that was like the largest shipping company in the world at that point in time when they went out of business, and itself, regardless of the excess capacity before that led up to them going out of business, them exiting the market opened the door for all other shippers to sort of consume that market share that they did have, and that they gained through some kind of shady practices and undercutting and, you know, like way undercutting full container load prices and less than container load prices to get all that business, or to get all that market share that they did have. It was ultimately part of their demise. But when that market share opened up, all these other carriers like gobbled it up at higher rates. So I mean, those are huge ramifications for a lot of the like mid-level to like slightly larger companies that were shipping a lot from Asia or Southeast Asia or China.
And just to add to that, I think there's also like a sudden increase of air cargo business as well. It's like, you know, with all this commotion going on, like last thing you want to do is ship through like a cargo, you know. So and kind of some of the reading of how you did too. So.
Oh, and also on like from the first point, like as long as how long will we feel the effects? I mean, it's, you know, January 2019, and I would say that we're still feeling the effects of Hanjin exiting the market. It's still like a shock wave that's still coming through. Like we're getting the ripple effect, I guess, from it still happening. And I think that for the foreseeable future, we'll see that until another shipping company gets to that largest shipping company in the world status and starts to consume a lot of that market share or a lot of the lanes. Because now it's kind of spread out amongst other carriers. So as far as like our companies feeling impact, I mean, I know Stefan just talked about Nike and how they felt the impact of the Hanjin fallout. From my perspective, I actually was working at the Port of Portland at the time that Hapag-Lloyd and Hanjin pulled out of the port. So that in and of itself was a big impact, and there was a lot of buzz around the office about that situation and what we were going to do and what Terminal 6 was going to do to deal with that. And it was always a touchy subject with the ITSC, I want to say is the initials of the managing company that managed Terminal 6 for the Port of Portland. But with Hanjin leaving the Port of Portland and Hapag-Lloyd leaving the Port of Portland, like that was huge. And then when Hanjin went out of business, I was working for a contract manufacturer that dealt a lot with carbon steel. And that was another way that distributors raised their price immediately, right? Because they're like, oh, Hanjin's leaving, so it's going to make everything go up, even before that happened. So it was a direct impact of the companies that I was working for at that time.
Yeah. So I think we led into the second question, which is great. I think, you know, for Boeing, I think most of our shipping is definitely done through rail, so trucking. So I don't know that we were drastically affected by the Hanjin situation, but, you know, I think for companies to be able to avoid something like this and mitigate that risk, definitely like diversifying your transportation base, right? Making sure you're not using the same company for all of your shipping. It's definitely something that a lot of companies could have done to try to lessen their impact.
Yeah.
For us, for future, I wasn't with the company yet, but I did ask around. However, they said that like the lead times is increased by a substantial amount. And as far as for our customers as well too, some of them had to postpone some of the design and design work. So they had to, instead of from Q1 to Q2 instead. So that's basically the ramification happening to it. So.
All right. I think Stefan, you already shared kind of about Nike, so that's great. We can move into our last question. So there have been many factors that contributed to Hanjin's demise, such as major losses during the 2008 financial crisis, which came shortly after orders of several megaships, general hubris, and excessive container capacity worldwide. Do we think that Hanjin had time to recover from the crisis, or did they simply ignore lessons learned from the massive losses accepted during that time?
So that's an interesting question. What I got from the articles that we read was it wasn't necessarily that they ignored it. They definitely acknowledged it. And I think that it was the one thing that they really couldn't ever recover from was that the financial crisis in 2008, after they had these ships on order and they were forced to take ships due to contractual obligations. And with the downturn in shipping because of the financial crisis, I mean, they just never really recovered from that, and they just started incurring loss after loss after loss, and they tried to expand their volume to take up the capacity that they had by essentially losing money on certain lanes because they would just undercut everyone else to fill their ship and then ship. But I mean, their fuel, their cost to ship, and all that was eating into their profit. So they were like razor thin margins to begin with because they were competing with all these other shippers. And then just that was definitely the biggest part of their demise, I would say.
When I was reading about it, the comparison that came to mind for me was really kind of the GM mindset at the same time, where GM really had the capacity to build 4 or 5 million cars a year. And so all of a sudden, when demand, was cut in half for 18 months, they still felt like they needed to use that capacity in some way. And they were basically burning the last of their capital base to do that. And I think about Hanjin, and they have this tremendous shipping capacity. They have new ships on order. And then all of a sudden you have a global recession that's for the first time actually dipping GDP. Both on the demand side in North America and in Europe, but also starting to hurt the demand side for Western goods in China. And it just seems like at a time where they were really ramping up for continued double-digit growth, they ended up in a position where they had committed capacity, they had capital investments, and the marginal loss on every one of those containers must have felt so small. But it just seems like cumulatively, as soon as they ran out of liquidity, their business their business couldn't shake it off anymore. And that maybe if they had been able to hang on for another 5 or 10 months and they'd been able to secure additional funding, maybe they would have seen themselves through the other side of it. But it sounded like they had been operating at a loss long enough. With so much of their asset base tied up and being paid for, that is, as soon as that demand went down, they really lost their place in the marketplace, and they became insolvent.
Mm-hmm.
And just to kind of add to that, I feel like they do have the time, like with all the timeline, the years on crisis, the financial crisis, the China slowdown in 2010. I feel like those were like precursor to what's about to happen, and they try reacting to it, but I just feel like it's a little too late already. So, before then, they're going bankrupt now. So.
Yep. All right. Does anyone have any other points they want to add?
I mean, other than that, it was pretty interesting to understand that when a shipping company goes out of business, that their ships that are in transit are just stuck on the water, and no port will let them even dock. Was pretty crazy to think about.
Yeah.
Especially like there were people who weren't even involved and were just like, there's that one artist that was in residence on board one of those ships that was like stuck in the waters outside of Tokyo, and the fact that they can't even get off the ship just because no one's there to pay the bills. And then like to think about all the cargo that's on there. Like, I mean, like Stefan was saying about the Nikes being like building up inventory. And then when you finally did release that ship, it's months past, they've already flown in inventory. Now you have triple the inventory on your shelves, and you start offloading it into whatever Big Lots or Costco. Which is...
I definitely couldn't even imagine being in like freight forwarding after that happened, like trying to scramble to get, goods that you were expecting at a certain port that could have arrived at a different port. And then you're trying to scramble alternative transportation, whether that be rail or trucking, right? When everyone else is probably trying to do the exact same thing. I could imagine that was probably pretty crazy.
Yeah. I mean, like when they did finally unload ships, like it was probably tantamount to the port slowdown when there was all the longshoreman issues before. I mean, like then when all those ships all of a sudden got offloaded, there was like chassis issues, like they didn't have enough chassis to even move the cans. There was, trucker issues where they didn't have enough CDL drivers to like even move them off the port property. So there was just like stacks and stacks and stacks of food rotting and other stuff that could just spoil, just going to waste because we didn't have the infrastructure to move it because it was kind of just over capacity immediately.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy to think about, but hey, that's the fun world of logistics, right?
Yeah, I think the really interesting one for me in the question is that she used the word hubris of, things are always going to go up. We're too big to fail. And I think right now as we're entering a cycle where people are talking about another potential global slowdown, my mind kind of goes to other companies that have gone really heavy on logistics capacity. I think the first one that comes to mind for me right now is Amazon. Who it feels like everybody's got an Amazon DC in their backyard now. I'm really curious if that's flexible capacity that they're going to be able to scale up and down with demand, or if we see a company like Amazon, if consumer demand takes a 5% or a 10% dip next year, whether all of a sudden they're going to have a similar issue where all of a sudden they have these capital assets that they're no longer using.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And just to add to that, like I was thinking also after this, I would think a lot of companies are multi-sourcing now as far as their shipments or their logistics, just because you don't want to put all your eggs in the basket. In this case, like in one container in a basket, and then this is what happens basically. And like the one that stood out to me the most also was Samsung had to pay like $8 million to charge a phone. To me, that's kind of just like straight out in the movies, to be honest. So
yeah.
It's pretty bad.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So if that's everyone's comments, then I think we will end our session. Thank you, Emily. Thanks for listening.